Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guest today is Nick Leiserson, the Assistant National Cyber Director for Cyber Policy and Programs at the White House Office of the National Cyber Director. Hey, Nick, thank you for joining our program.
Happy to do it, Justin. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. It's been a busy year for ONCD. I think it's probably been a busy couple of years, but at least now we've been able to see the National Cyber Strategy, the National Cyber Strategy Implementation Plan. There's been a number of RFIs have gone out. So you guys are all done, right? Everything's all set in cyberspace and we're good to go. What is the latest on the implementation of this big national cyber strategy? So many lines of effort, but from the White House policy perspective, what are you tracking as the latest big things here?
Great. Well, thanks, Justin. And yes, as you know, soon it'll be done and all of cyber will be solved. So we're in great shape now. But as you say, it's been a very exciting year for ONCD and for the administration at this point with the release of the National Cybersecurity Strategy in March. And it's two major strategic shifts to shift responsibility for cybersecurity onto the actors most able to bear it and to incentivize investments in long-term resilience. And the manifestation of the strategy, right, as my boss, the acting National Cyber Director, Kemba Walden, likes to say, her favorite page of the strategy is the last one. And on that last page, it says, hey, implementation is really where the rubber hits the road, where actually, a strategy is as good as its implementation. What you want in the strategy is the ability for a diverse set of stakeholders, in this case, across the government and the private sector. Cyber is hard. It needs it's a team sport. To be aligned in kind of what they're doing. And the implementation plan is really intended to be the roadmap to those efforts. So as you say, we've got 69 initiatives in this implementation plan. We are hitting the ground running. We have already knocked off 3 of them that are finished. One was actually finished 2 weeks after the strategy itself was released. Because, as things happen, sometimes it takes a little while to get the final product out the door. But we'll take credit anyways. So we've already knocked off a couple of the initiatives. We expect them to keep rolling through. I mean, one of the things that was very important to our office and to the administration is that we have transparency with this implementation plan. It says in the strategy itself that we will publish it. It is up on whitehouse.gov. I encourage everyone to go read it. But please don't read it cover to cover because you will quickly discover that it was once a spreadsheet and it reads like it. But if you use the find function on your PDF viewer, it is your friend, and you will find all sorts of interesting things that are probably relevant to your work. And one of the things that's in there as well is completion dates. So you can go and look and see, here are the things that we expect to be done in the fourth quarter of fiscal year 2023. And those are certainly on the top of our mind at ONCD. We're responsible for some of them, but we also have a responsibility in the strategy to look across all of the agencies and departments and make sure we're kind of on track. So that's certainly what gets me up in the morning, right, is how are we doing across these 69 key initiatives? They're not intended to cover the entire waterfront of what the federal government is doing, but there are key things that require executive level and interagency attention and that are specifically designed to achieve the strategic objectives that the president laid out in his strategy. So that's a lot of what we're doing right now, again, is focus as we're heading to the end of this fiscal year on what some of the initiatives that are wrapping soon are, but also we are looking, as we said when we launched the implementation plan, this is a living document. Talk about the strategy, which nests under the national security strategy. And the president there said, we are living in a decisive decade, right? This is setting the future of our country. A lot of the decisions we make now are going to significantly affect the rest of the 21st century. The national cybersecurity strategy fits exactly under that umbrella and has a similar time frame in it. The implementation plan does not. Again, we are not going to snap our fingers when the last item is done in fiscal year 2026 and say, ta-da, we have fully implemented the strategy. That's not our intent. Our intent is to continue to iterate on this document on an annual basis with new initiatives that come about because of changes in the threat landscape, new technologies that have come on the scene, and also because some of the actions that we have are going to beget follow-on actions, and we want to be able to track them as well. So even as we're kind of nose to the grindstone right now, working to implement the 69 initiatives, we're also looking over the horizon a bit to see what's going to be coming in Implementation Plan 2.0, which we expect to be out in the spring of next year.
Wow, yeah. So a lot of activity obviously laid out in that implementation plan. And it's great, of course, to know that there's going to be updates, because often we see these documents come out of government and, you kind of wonder 2 years later, well, what happened to that? When you're talking about some of the key metrics that you're tracking across the federal government to understand progress on implementation, there's a lot laid out in that plan. There's so much that could kind of come in from the outside to affect those different dates, whether it's, as you said, developments in the cybersecurity world, the threat environment. There's, budget pressures agencies are dealing with a lot. How is ONCD kind of working with agencies both to hold them accountable to meeting some of these deadlines, but also to help them, where they might need help with either budgetary issues, authorities, otherwise? Is there a general sort of approach there?
Yeah, it's a great balancing act, let me tell you, right? And I think, again, the most important thing for us and for the president and for the administration on this point is we're going to be transparent. Again, we had the publication of the implementation plan itself, which in itself is a bit novel, but we are also going to be delivering to the president at his request and to Congress an annual report that kind of tells us how we're doing across all of these different initiatives. And, I think the expectation is there is going to have to be some flex because things change in the world. And if we don't recognize that up front and say, no, we're going to stay the course on this path, instead of saying technology evolves, the threat landscape evolves, and we have to be able to pivot, then we're not going to get the outcomes that we want. At the same time, part of the reason, again, that's why we have an iterative document, and we don't expect too much to change in the very immediate, next 6 to 8 months or however long until we see the next version of the implementation plan. And to that end, my team is working with the interagency. There are 18 agencies, 17 plus ONCD, that own an initiative or one or more initiatives in the implementation plan. Again, from the outset, we said we want one. Senator King used to say of the Office of the National Cyber Director, he wanted one throat to choke. We similarly we want someone that is a clear owner of each of the initiatives and has ownership of it, and also the accountability that comes with that. We view our role, right, as the coordinator that the president has put us in this position for the implementation plan. We view our role as advocates for the interagency, right? Like, we are all on Team Cyber together. We're not going to get the outcomes that we need in cybersecurity unless we're all working together as one interagency. And we work with our colleagues at the Department of Homeland Security or at the FBI or at US Cybercom or wherever it may be. We work directly with our colleagues to try and understand exactly what it is that they need to get these initiatives done and help them with it. And a great example of that, I think, is the budget guidance. This is the second year that we've had cybersecurity budget guidance co-signed between the National Cyber Director and the Director of the Office of Management and Budget. This is direction to agencies that say, here are priorities in these are national priorities that we expect to see agencies reflect in their budgets. And if you go and read this year's budget priorities memo, you'll see it aligns directly to the strategy. It's like, here are each of the 5 pillars of the strategy. Here are the areas of investment that we need to see in FY25 budget requests in order to make sure that we can actually achieve those goals. So we are very much mindful of the fact that, there's a lot of work that's laid out to get us where we need to go, and that we at ONCD are, yes, looking to make sure we understand and are holding ourselves and the rest of the interagency accountable for what the president has signed them up for, so that, and reporting to that end, but also saying we need to be advocates and we're going to do the best that we can from our position in the White House to make sure that the resources and whatever red tape cutting, however we can help make sure that agencies can achieve these various initiatives.
One particularly interesting aspect of the strategy from a federal perspective is, using the power of the federal purse to improve accountability, improve cybersecurity in the technology ecosystem. I'm sure there's so many different initiatives that you can point to that might get at that, but what is ONCD particularly paying attention to when it comes to how agencies use their budgets to prioritize secure by design, secure development, things like that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's something I think that the administration is very committed to. And you can see that through one of the first major actions that we took, which was the issuance of Executive Order 14028. And there are actually significant changes to the federal acquisition regulation tied to EO 14028 that are carried forward as things that are key priorities in the National Cybersecurity Strategy, where we talk in Strategic Objective 3.5 about the need to leverage the market power that the federal government has and the purchasing power we have to drive changes in the ecosystem. And in the implementation plan, where there are, in fact, two initiatives in the implementation plan. I unfortunately have most of them committed to memory, so I just use the numbers. But 3.2.1 and 3.5.1, for those of you following along at home, that are specifically tied to updates to the federal acquisition regulation to address cybersecurity. And this really runs the gamut in terms of the kinds of updates we have in mind. The three major FAR rules that are currently under consideration by the FAR Council and will be released for comment in the future are tied to contracting requirements and making sure that they are consistent across the contracting space and are consistent as well with requirements that we're levering on federal enterprise systems. They have to do with cyber incident reporting and threat information and making sure that that is being communicated back to a contracting officer or contracting agency so that they understand if there's an implication of something that's been breached that could affect their systems and software. And then, as you mentioned, kind of the secure by design question, and how do we ensure not only that we have the cybersecurity features in what we're buying, and that the contractors that are entrusted with federal data are taking care at an operational level to protect it, but also that there's some degree of quality, right? There's a software quality metric here that we're very interested in to know that indeed the software products that we're procuring have cybersecurity and secure development practices associated with them. So across kind of all three of these areas, you can expect to see, again, in accordance with both the strategy and the executive order, changes to the acquisition regulation so that we are both making sure, part of EO 14028, a fundamental idea in it is that we need to raise the bar for the federal government. And what we're really doing through these contracting rules is making sure that we're also applying that to anything that the federal government is buying and procuring as well. And we do think that this should set the standard for other folks as well. And critical infrastructure, for instance, who we really would hope would say, hey, if that's the degree of rigor that you're providing to your federal government customer, we want that too. And we encourage that because that absolutely will raise all of the boats in kind of the cybersecurity ecosystem.
And, related to this conversation, one thing I noticed that ONCD is specifically responsible for is using federal grants to incentivize security and infrastructure. I'm just wondering, are there any updates, anything to share along those lines at this point and on that specific objective?
Yeah, so the thing that we're really focused on as part of the implementation plan, right, is another lever that we have. So we have the procurement lever of this is what we are able to, when we purchase, we can maybe put some requirements there. But we also have the fact that the administration is really injected an unprecedented level of new investment into our infrastructure, both kind of the traditional physical infrastructure that you would think about, like roads and bridges, all the way to some of the advanced manufacturing that the CHIPS and Science Act is encouraging to go forward onshore. And across all of these, we look and say, well, there is still some asphalt that is poured that really does not have any connection, but it's in fact rare that you see a modern bridge built where it's not instrumented in some way. And that provides great safety benefits. It provides terrific benefits for maintenance as well. But it also means that even things that you think is, hey, this is just a concrete slab, is in fact part of the Internet of Everything. And whether it's that to something that's advanced manufacturing, where you think, oh, actually, yes, this makes a lot of sense that it's connected and there's a cybersecurity dimension. What we're trying to do at ONCD is to help all levels of the grant-making process. So that would be federal agencies, would be pass-through entities like a state department of transportation, for instance, all the way down to whatever a final grant recipient might be. So like a contractor, understand what it is that they can do to ensure that these projects are cyber secure and that their networks themselves are cyber secure, right? Because both of these are important. That, we know when grant dollars are going out that they're going to contractors or recipients of whatever form that have secure networks, and that also the projects, whatever they're building to last using this money, has cybersecurity built in from the outset. And again, a lot of what we're doing at ONCD right now is trying to help translate the many requirements that exist out there and help answer the number one question we get when we have conversations with colleagues in state agencies, for example, which is, I believe you that this is something important for our national security and our economic security. What I don't know is, what is it exactly that you're asking me to do? Like, how do I actually effectuate this, especially given maybe challenges in the workforce? And this is really what we're doing in pursuant to the implementation plan, is really helping to get a playbook together that will help folks across all three of these communities better understand what steps they can do to improve the cybersecurity, again, both of themselves and of the projects that we're making in accordance with the president's vision for investing in America.
Will that be an actual playbook that you all publish, or is that more just an example, kind of a per se playbook?
Yeah, so we're developing the materials right now, and then in terms of how we have the name of this thing has changed many times. On the one hand, I really like the playbook moniker. On the other hand, you talk to a lot of cybersecurity folks and they're like, right, incident response playbooks. Like, it's not that. So we'll, if you have any great ideas, Justin, for a title, we'd love to hear them. But yeah, right now we're working on developing the thing itself, and that's what we hope to have done soon. And then we're talking with folks in the interagency about what are the best channels to get this out so that the people, again, at federal agencies making the grants at pass-through entities like state governments and final grant recipients all can kind of have a resource they can rely on to just better understand what it is that they should be thinking about in this space.
Okay. And, this leads us perfectly into the next topic I wanted to discuss, which is critical infrastructure, obviously a huge focus of this national cybersecurity strategy we're talking about. I think one thing the strategy seems to focus on is the capabilities of sector risk management agencies across government. How are you at ONCD working with the National Security Council to, address the capabilities of those agencies, any gaps and authorities and elsewhere?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it is something I think that we recognize at ONCD is absolutely critical to our success. So again, pillar one of the strategy is defend critical infrastructure. So we start from the premise of this is really important, and in addition to being really important, it's also really challenging. It has not been traditional that we've really had people in commercial businesses that are just core fundamental to our national security. And this is one of the great challenges of cybersecurity. It's what makes it a fascinating policy problem. And if you look at the strategy and you look at the implementation plan and see how many different initiatives that have SRMA, sector risk management agencies, called out as contributing entities, and you'll see how important we view their role in terms of helping us to address these very real problems. So one of the first projects that ONCD worked on actually was looking at SRMA cyber capacity, and that really has helped inform some of the initiatives that came out, particularly with respect to scaling public-private collaboration. And looking at, there are some things that are happening in the implementation plan that are perfectly dovetailed, as you mentioned, with our colleagues on the National Security Council, who are leading interagency processes right now to look at Presidential Policy Directive 21, which is kind of governs critical infrastructure resilience policy. It's a document from 2013. Last year, the president announced that there was an ongoing effort to update it. And some of those things, for instance, designating who are the sector risk management agencies and what are the sectors, are also captured in the implementation plan. But we also look and say, hey, what are models that are evolving, right? I mean, one of the things that's been fascinating to me is how much of cybersecurity policy today can be traced back to Presidential Decision Directive 63, which is a Clinton era policy document. It was released in 1998 and has concepts like ISACs that we live with today and kind of take as like, oh yeah, absolutely, this is part of the fabric of critical infrastructure in the cyber policy landscape. That dates all the way back to 1998. And there is an initiative in the implementation plan that says, how are we evolving our collaboration, public-private collaboration? How are we moving beyond just information sharing, right? In ISAC, information sharing and analysis center, to more operational collaboration. And that is done by the SRMAs, because that's really the entry point for sectors in terms of helping to understand their risk and the consequences of incidents there, right? You look at CISA, and they are cybersecurity experts and have a really good understanding of the ecosystem and vulnerabilities there too. They are not a lot of doctors. And when you look at a ransomware incident in a hospital, you really need to marry up both the technical expertise of what are the systems that are hit, what's the situation with backups, how long is it going to take to get things back online, where CISA or the FBI might have really helpful insights to provide, and the impact of, well, what does it mean for patient care? Because it's not the systems really that we care about, it's the patients. And it's HHS, right? It's the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response in their office that really understands this and is staffed with doctors and people who can say, oh, I understand what that impact is, and making sure that sector risk management agencies have the capacity, right, as you mentioned, to do their roles is really important. We recognize that sectors are different and that there's not a one-size-fits-all model, which is part of the reason, again, in the implementation plan, you'll see it calls out the need for CISA to develop a support capability that can really be tailored on a sector-by-sector and SRMA-by-SRMA basis to say, these are kind of where CISA can stand in to help, depending on the maturity and how many resources you've got at hand as a sector risk management agency, and here's where the SRMA is going to be in the lead. But fundamentally, if you read both the budget guidance from last year and from this year, you'll see sector risk management agency cyber capabilities is right on the forefront of our minds. And again, that ranges from kind of what you would traditionally think of as SRMA functions in terms of going out and helping to exchange information with the private sector, all the way to saying, SRMAs in the budget guidance, they need to be better consumers of intelligence. And they need to be better consumers of intelligence and work with the intelligence community so that they can better reflect the needs of their sectors to the intelligence community and create a demand signal. And that's, the only way that they can do that is if they have the resources and the personnel who can spend the time reading the existing intelligence and saying, this is helpful, this we need to get out to the sector, or we need more of this other thing in order to ensure that they're prepared to counter the threats we face. So a long way of saying that SRMAs are absolutely vital to the success of the strategy and something that we care a lot about at ONCD.
And Nick, another thing that ONCD recently released was a request for information on cybersecurity regulatory harmonization. I know this is a big initiative for ONCD. The cyber strategy talks about the need for some sort of baseline level regulation, I think, but at the same time, you want to make sure there isn't just this uncoordinated patchwork. What does this harmonization process look like, and particularly past October 31st when those comments close on the RFI?
This is really near and dear to heart at ONCD. It's initiative 1.1.1. First thing, you flip open the implementation plan and you didn't take my advice to control F your way through it, you will see regulatory harmonization right on the front burner. And I think, the first thing that I would say as in terms of how do we think about it and where do we want to go with this is we really want to say harmonization and reciprocity, because the way that I like to think of it is kind of a crawl, walk, run model, where crawling is alignment, right? Is saying that do we have across regulators a common understanding of risk, a common taxonomy, the words that we choose around cybersecurity regulation, do they kind of line up? And we've actually done a pretty good job of that. And that owes an enormous amount of credit to NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, for their cybersecurity framework, which has been instrumental in helping ensure that regulators have a common understanding of how to manage cyber risk. So if that's alignment, then we talk about harmonization, where we say, okay, we're singing from the same hymnal at least, but can we get onto the same page? And that is really where we talk about harmonized requirements, where we say we prefer not to see that certainly as a baseline for technologies that are common across critical infrastructure sectors, we would prefer not to see differing requirements or even worse, contradictory requirements, both because there are some entities that operate and are regulated by multiple regulators, and they operate in multiple sectors, and also because it probably doesn't make policy sense, right? It's probably true that one of these is actually going to be more effective at mitigating your cyber risk, and let's choose that one, not the one that contradicts it. But we made some progress with that. And, the financial services sector, for instance, has really been leading in trying to develop succeeding in developing a unified examiner's handbook that helps some of the big financial services regulators actually ensure that they're asking the same questions. But even asking the same questions doesn't get us quite where we need to be, which is we want reciprocity, so that if I'm asking the same question as another regulator down the street, when you've shown to me that you are meeting whatever that requirement might be, whatever the certification you get from me, the piece of paper that says, yes, I have investigated your system and I am confident that you are doing what is required, that will suffice for the next regulator in line, rather than having to go through an entirely different compliance process to really prove the same thing, because we're asking the same question. And that's really where we want to get to. We want to do that for three reasons. The first reason is that there are, right, at a base level, there are entities right now that are regulated by multiple federal regulators. And if you're one of those entities and, have to do different things for different regulators, we think that it really makes a lot of sense to try and, again, for the baseline, get that common so that you're only doing that work once. And you can spend more time actually focused on cybersecurity and less focused on compliance. The second reason is, even if you're not regulated by multiple US regulators, you might be regulated by the United States and some international regulators, for instance, in the European Union. And one of the things that we really believe in is trying to get a good, harmonized, reciprocal model working in the United States so that we can show that as to our partners in other countries and say, this is a model, this works, this reduces the burden on business and still gives you even better cybersecurity outcomes. So let's try and bring that same harmonization and reciprocity to international regimes. And even if you don't fit into either of those two categories, you're domestic business, you're a water utility, you're a manufacturer, and you're like, yeah, I'm not really regulated by the EU, for instance, and there's only one regulator that's looking after me right now, I would still argue that this is in your interest, because you will benefit from economies of scale that come from having a unified baseline where people don't have to spend a lot of time and money on compliance, because you might be able to go to a service provider and say, yeah, they are certified to do this kind of work. And because they've already got that certification, their customer base is broadened, since it's not a different one for the energy sector, for the financial services sector, for the chemical sector, for the transportation sector, or really the many subsectors of the transportation sector. Instead, it's one thing. And so your compliance costs will go down anyways. So we find this to be a pretty compelling case for why we need to be looking at this problem. But, this is a policymaker's view of the world, and we're not on the front lines dealing with this. We have been talking to regulators through the cybersecurity forum for independent and executive branch regulators for more than a year now on this topic. And, we think we're making some good progress with them. There are a lot of folks who really do view cybersecurity regulations in an area that they can continue to improve on. But the folks that are at the front lines are industry, right, are the folks in the critical infrastructure sectors. And that's why we put out this request for information with a deadline that we extended, because we got a letter basically as soon as it went out the door saying, hey, we have a lot of thoughts and would prefer a little bit more than 2 months to get this turned around. So we have a deadline for that of October 31st. And again, we're open-minded about this. I've laid out kind of our theory of the case, but we're open to hearing from industry that we're right, we're spot on, this is the right direction to go in, or not. Because I think at the end of the day, right, we do believe that there need to be baseline requirements across critical infrastructure sectors. That's right there in the very beginning of the strategy, and it's a critical part of ensuring that there are investments in long-term resilience, which is one of our 2 strategic shifts. But we think we can do it smartly, and harmonization and reciprocity is a key part of doing it smartly. And so we really hope that everyone who's listening to this today will go check out regs.gov and, file comments that say, you're spot on, Nick, or that say, no, you're way off base, because we need to hear from industry about what it is exactly that we should be targeting from a policymaking standpoint.
Got it. And your comment about relying on managed services. I mean, a lot of companies in whatever sector they're in are increasingly relying on things like cloud services. So that it makes me think about, things like the FedRAMP program and the assessments that they already do for federal agencies. I think there's a state ramp that various states are increasingly relying on. Is that kind of factoring it all into this conversation around critical infrastructure regulations and how, managed service providers, cloud service providers are assessed under these either existing or forthcoming regulations?
Yeah, so I think we're not trying to prejudge what a framework would look like, but I think certification is one of the things that at least, I am not that creative a person, and certification is certainly one of the things that I look at and say, yeah, this makes sense, right? This is having a certificate, having a license, having a whatever you want to call it, to be able to show I have met these requirements does lend itself to reciprocity. In terms of FedRAMP specifically, right? FedRAMP is designed for enclaves within cloud service providers that process federal information. The remit of the program is specifically for federal systems and people operating systems on behalf of the federal government. But it's certainly a model that we would invite feedback on, right? We do invite feedback specifically on what are models that one might look to, or what are areas of reciprocity that exist. And this is kind of in an acquisitions context, but they are the acquisition regulation. So I think it's fair game to say, yeah, here is something that we think is effective or not from industry's standpoint in terms of saying, once I get a FedRAMP certification, I can use that at another agency. In many cases, and certainly if you go through the process with that in mind, you can do that and hopefully reduce the amount of burden that you would have to do to show this over and over again. So again, I don't think that we're prejudging what would an effective model be for critical infrastructure, so much as saying that is a model that has reciprocity baked in, and we would welcome comments on how well is it working, and how could it be applied, probably through a different program or through, if Congress expanded the program, whatever it might look like, but how could that model be applied in a critical infrastructure context?
Okay, I wanted to turn to the resilient futures portion of the strategy here before we run out of time. I know everything we've been talking about is about the future, of course, but there's the specific resilient future section of it. I know one of the things that is specifically called out in there, I think, is software liability. That's one of the hot topics that came out of the cyber strategy. I think, this is something I think folks have already said is going to take some time to get at. But what's the general plan that you've charted out for tackling what seems on its face like a pretty thorny issue?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I was the person that you may have heard say this is going to take a while, because I said that when we launched Pillar 3 of the strategy, and I will say it again today. If you look at the initiative tied to software liability, specifically in the implementation plan, it is tied to some legal work that has been ongoing, or that we have seen going on in academic circles in the wake of the strategy's release. And we're driving to kind of holding a legal symposium to make sure that we understand as policymakers what has come before, right? Like, what is it that exists in other areas of the law, particularly tied to product liability, but just in general, liability frameworks that exist out there, and then hopefully marry them with some interdisciplinary work with your friendly neighborhood computer scientist. I am not a lawyer, but I do have a degree in computer science, and there are lots of things that I run into in legal frameworks that I say, oh wow, that doesn't work for the problem you're dealing with is much more complex than with the kind of civil engineering problem. My shorthand is Mother Nature, is really a tough adversary, but she's not really intentionally trying to kill you. She does not have you in particular in her sights. And obviously that's not true in cyberspace. And the laws of nature that, but for some quantum stuff, it mostly held true since the 17th century. There are no laws in cyberspace. We make the laws. So it's a constantly changing environment with an adversary who is out to get you. And the complexity factor just shoots through the roof for that reason. And really, that's a lot of what we're trying to suss out through this legal work is where are areas of the law where we say, for instance, supply chains, like I like to pick on this as something that's like, well, software supply chains are incredibly complex. And then I say, yeah, but many auto manufacturers have 30,000-ish different vendors who help put your car together. So that is also a very complex supply chain that we have ways to allocate liability against. So in that case, I'm like, no, I think that existing law is likely to help us versus, some of the standards that we might design against where we say, hey, we have a pretty good understanding of what it takes to stand up to 75-mile-an-hour winds when it comes to concrete. Build your building against that. And if something happens above that, you're not liable for it. And in software, it's like, yeah, we don't know how to write perfectly bug-free code. There are new classes of vulnerabilities. I remember when Meltdown Inspector came out and it was like, oh my goodness, I have not spent a lot of time thinking about actually how chips work and kind of what you might be able to do from things that are below where you traditionally operate in the software space, or even Rowhammer, another great example of like, oh, the physics of memory. Yeah, this wasn't really on my radar when I was taking computer security courses in undergrad. All of which is to say, right, it is an incredibly complex topic. And what we're trying right now is to say, what can we draw on from existing liability regimes? Where do we need some new thought? And what is kind of the menu of options that we can then go out to both the interagency, but importantly to industry as well, and say, this is kind of what we're thinking. And we're not thinking of it in completely abstract terms in terms of saying, the outcome that we want, which is to say, to your point on resilience, we want to incentivize more investment upfront in software quality such that, you are incentivized if you're writing software to spend more time looking for and quashing bugs before you ship product. That's what we're trying to get at. But in terms of the how, we're looking for this symposium to help outline some of the possible hows that we could pursue. And then we're going to turn back and go to industry and say, look, we're aiming for efficacy here. That is the thing that we want to know. We want to know which of these things is actually going to motivate changes to push more quality control for cybersecurity upfront in the design phase, and help us figure out which of these regimes will do that with the minimum burden possible, right? I think we are saying, again, the strategic shift in question here, this is a software liability is actually the marrying of the two, where we're saying is very high leverage because software is reused across the industry. So there's a smaller number, a subset of folks that we can get to improve security, and that benefits everyone in the ecosystem. But it's also incentivizing investments. And we are saying that, our thesis is we want to invest more in secure software development. That is something we hear from customers of software, whether they're individual users or businesses in critical infrastructure or otherwise all the time. We wish there were fewer patches. We wish we didn't have to worry so much about the quality of software that we get. And we're saying, what are the effective ways that we can incentivize more of that? And we view software liability as one of the umbrellas under which we can do it, but we are not going to just, take what we've learned from the symposium and try and jam something through. What we're going to do is say, here are some of the options that we've had. We're pretty confident that any three of these might work, but how do we tune them in a way that incentivizes the investment that we want to see, but doesn't break innovation in a way that, actually ends up net harming what we're going after here.
Got it. Thank you for that overview. We have about 20 seconds left, but really quickly, when is that symposium scheduled to be held?
Sometime in second quarter of fiscal year 24. So between January and March of next year.
All right, something to really look out for there. Well, I'm sure we could keep talking about a lot more of the implementation plan, but unfortunately, we are at time. So, again, I'd like to thank today's guest, Nick Leiserson, the Assistant National Cyber Director for Cyber Policy and Programs at the White House Office of the National Cyber Director. Nick, thanks again.
Thanks, Justin. It was great talking with you.
You as well. I'm your moderator, Justin Doubleday, and you're watching Federal News Network. Let me send you back to the studio for more on the Cyber Leaders Exchange.